this down here. What are the ecosystem services are worth? Sometimes they're intangible. Yes.
Well, sorry, I meant to continue that was the significance of perhaps considering beneficiaries, that trust arrangements, notional trusts may in some instances be more appropriate than talking about rights, because beneficiaries may have something less than a clear right, analogous to a discretionary trust or various types of intergenerational trust arrangements.
Yes.
It may not be a clear, determinable, enforceable, immediately enforceable right, but it would be an interest as a beneficiary.
Okay.
And so trust arrangements may sometimes, the language may be more useful, the conceptual structures may be more useful. When we're talking about particularly more nebulous, if you like, benefits such as carbon sequestration at global level.
Okay. So, going from rights and trust and so forth into what are ecosystem services worth? If you have to put a market value on a development project, how do you evaluate what you're giving up? For example, the port in Kenya. Was it Kenya?
Lamu.
Yeah, Lamu. Okay, so the indigenous people and fishing communities and so forth claim their rights under international, regional, and national law, at least to participate in the process, right? And to perhaps share the benefits therefrom. So there may not be a clear-cut delineation of who has the rights to claim, the benefits or the ownership or whatever of the ecosystem services, but it's important to know what you would be losing if a development project, for example, came in to the area. What whoever the beneficiaries are, from local to global, what are the impacts of that development, and how much would it cost to remediate? And that was going to be my talk today. Today was about mitigation and strategies for example, development of wetlands in the United States, and how you ascertain what is an equivalent wetland in order to mitigate the destruction of one wetland. How do you determine whether another wetland is of equal value for ecosystem services and so forth, but I don't have time to get into all of that. But in terms of reasoned decision making, I think it's really important to try to think about these things in a somewhat logical way so that you can try to negotiate from a position of principle rather than simple, guesswork or. And I think it's also important to be thinking through the implications of any of these development actions, not only for the present time, but also for the whole life cycle of whatever the development project is, or the timber harvesting or whatever, and how to maintain a sustainable level of ecosystem services within the area, regardless of what activities you're carrying on. Does that make sense? Yeah.
If the question of who has the right, the question of who has the right to include future generation, the answer are what ecosystem services are worth. We are in a fractal dimension. So it will make, it will say there is no way you can pay for a service. The price tag would be too much. And this is maybe the answer at the ethical aspect of paying for service. If you include future generation, your price tag is too high.
Right.
Well, maybe it's the structuring of that payment. I mean, if it goes and it's spent on cars or whatever right off the bat, then it's clearly you got to buy a lot of cars to make up for future generations. But if it's to build schools or alternative livelihoods or some other way that helps future generations succeed, then I would say it's not too costly.
Does that make sense? Okay, and so I'm just down now to point 5, just to reiterate though, trying to figure out what is a sustainable level of ecosystem services, and can whatever it is continue to not lose. Can you achieve what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers calls no net loss of ecosystem services, which might be done by mitigation another project that actually enhances the environment and the services, but these should all be considered, not just, they should be considered both in terms of how do you maintain an ecosystem with integrity within the area while still doing whatever is necessary to be done in that area. And also, how do you, assuming that the ecosystem is going to be altered, how do you, what do you do about that? Is there going to be restoration, for example? So what's the plan? Is there going to have to be, do people have to move? That sort of thing.
Can I ask you a question at this stage about this framework and in terms of this broad concept of payment for ecosystem services?
Right.
It seems that this is a framework which is very relevant in one context. There are different types of schemes that we can envisage, and this is one that seems to be linked to the idea that there might be payments by way of mitigation or offsetting damage arising from a project. So you can actually provide support for the protection of another area of high ecological value as a trade-off or a set-off against the loss of a particular area of ecological value. And so when you're asking the questions about altered ecosystems, restoration, etc., it's in that context. But of course, we know there's also a different scheme, which is based on the concept of custodianship and management.
Right.
And where the payments are essentially to try to find a means of supporting communities to ensure that traditional custodianship is maintained. And so there, I think the questions will need inevitably to be slightly altered to determine whether the scheme is a good one or not. A couple of the questions there, if I can just add, that we had in mind, if you don't mind, if I just raise this as perhaps the closing part of the discussion for this session around issues like if you pay one community to protect its ecosystem, are you likely to have this problem of what is often called leakage? That is, that other communities who are not receiving payments therefore experience more development pressure as a side effect from the payments to the community that does find that it can receive such a payment. So I think there are questions like that, and also questions around is there a risk that communities may be undercompensated or even exploited by these schemes? If we take our community down the road, would some system of payment there perhaps actually be used as a means of just simply, well, that's in the context of a development proposal, so I suppose it's not a good example, but I'm trying to think of other areas where perhaps the exploitation may be in the form of development, or it may be
maybe another thing is the custodianship. Does that mean that you freeze the culture in time and they're not really allowed to modernize and, build roads and that sort of thing?
Well, of course, one of the purposes of the payments is to try to assist communities in those circumstances to increase their well-being in terms of health, education, etc. So, on the face of it, we would hope that those would be the benefits, but those need to be clearly identifiable. Maybe locked into the scheme as well. Those are again questions that one would want to ask if a proposal is coming forward to a community. How can we ensure that the payments once received are going to be applied in the best interests of that community? So I just mention those because I think they're really important additional questions to consider.
Yeah, I think to put also on the table the name of custody, because I was suddenly frightened on the point 5 there. What happens when altering the ecosystem, or I start to understand that it was for compensate for altering the ecosystem. Custody is, I think, the idea of GEB as far as But I went to the place, to Gangjong village. Charming people. Please go there, 6 kilometers from the ECC. The place where is built the naval area is not only a place of fisheries, it's also a place for meditation. So intangible value.
Yes.
Of course, it would be difficult to put also a price tag on that. So undercompensate a community, it should be one only taking into account value, or maybe, but how to put value on that spiritual aspect?
Can I just make a comment on that as a final point? Because this raises the question that Owen raised about the beneficiaries. Who are the beneficiaries? On the one hand, the ecosystem itself is a beneficiary here. Future generations are beneficiaries. The whole community can be, the whole country can be a beneficiary. But this question of intangible value and the intangible linking, some would characterize it as spiritual values, is also very important. So when you talk about ecological services or ecosystem services, one can think about the transmission of intangible heritage from one generation to the next, as well as to this generation, to actually think about the link between a community and the ecosystem on which it depends as a specific ecosystem service. It goes beyond what we're talking about here, but it seems to me that that is a paradigm shift that has to be made if we're really serious about, for instance, the intangible heritage and its convention, for example. Yes,
just very briefly, our colleague here was very kind to, I'm sorry I don't hear you, Thomas was kind enough to just show me the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, characterization of ecosystem services, and they were regulatory services, provisional services, the goods, and cultural services, which actually include precisely these. So clearly there is some thinking here. You know, I mean, it's been well worked out, and perhaps that's the starting point for the lawyers to take this model and start where we're at and look at how they can be, what types of interests, let's say generally, rights, beneficiary interests, whatever, but what kinds of interests can be identified, can be protected, can be credibly attributed to which kinds of actors. And I think there's a very nice project right there.
yes.
Well, thank you for that, Owen. I think that's a great way to actually wrap it up, to take us back to that fundamental question of what are ecosystem services. I'm not sure this discussion will have necessarily led to any great new insights, but it may have opened up a little bit more just the question of the complexity of the issues involved in this new area. And I just finished by noting that within this Congress and within the context of Rio+20, all of this discussion around a green economy is leading to an enhanced preoccupation, if you like, with concepts such as this one. And it means that if you go back to this idea of reasoned decision making, we really do have to think much harder about what it is we're trying to do with this particular concept. How is it best applied? In whose interests is it applied? What is being protected? And in what circumstances is it really in the interests of both affected communities and their ecosystems? So with that, I just propose and thank you for what I think has been a great discussion, actually. Some really interesting thoughts put through there. And I think you now, Louisa, have a final session on enforcement, is it?
Yeah, the final session of the day.
So we'll turn over.
So, yeah, thank you.
So is everybody staying?
And may I also thank
I have a bride, you stay.
I'm sorry, I should have
I'll consider it. Well, while I'm getting the bride, just a bit about my sort of background, so apologies, but I've been away for 25 years, and the last, most of those years, I was in the sort of banking side of things, the estate planning side for wealthy individuals. And a couple of years ago, I switched to environmental law and went back and got an LLM in environmental law. And so I think that's probably why the organizers of this event gave me the fifth day, the fifth hour, and a lot of sort of tired people. So I've done my best to come up with ways to keep everybody entertained and at least active and at least awoken every couple minutes. So what I did learn is that bribery normally works. as does a sugar buzz. So I have brought all the way from Switzerland a bag of our famous candy Toblerone. So I'll pass those around, and feel free to take one or two, and hopefully the sugar will keep you going for the next 45 minutes or so.
So you wanted to use it to throw it at?
No, wait a minute. We'll get to that. So we're going to have a question and answer too as we move along here. So there may be additional rewards as we go out. But, no, go ahead and pass it around so everybody gets a little bit of sugar buzz going into the presentation. Okay, so just to put everything into context, we're going to the, I've got a presentation there behind us that I spent some time on, and it's been modified about 100 times, even today as we've been speaking. So to be perfectly honest, the way, when I agreed to do this and when I sort of was working on the presentation originally, I sort of planned for a primer on some of the things that I was aware of out there for individuals and NGOs to enforce their environmental rights. Sitting in a meeting yesterday, I realized that that's probably way below what people want to hear about. So I want to sort of go through those things that people know about, and then if we got enough time, I'm going to try to put up some new ideas, or put out some new ideas to see whether people can come up with any sort of solutions that they might be able to use back in their home countries or whomever they're advising. Okay, I'll start with a couple caveats. Whoops, go back to the last one. The first caveat is unfortunate. Whoops, one more. With this, no silver bullet. There we go. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. We've talked a lot over the last 5 days about the dream world of having an international environmental law, a dream world of having an international environmental court. That's a long ways away. I admire and I encourage everybody that continues to work towards that, but we're not there yet, and there are lots of problems out there that needs to be solved. And so I've been trying to focus on, please, the next slide, the tools that we can use. And as I said, none of them are perfect, but we've been handling the toolbox, and we are got to figure out what's in the toolbox best meets our needs. None of them's going to be perfect, but try to use them. Okay, so just sort of an overview of the kind of things I wanted to talk about. Let me just back up a second and say what I hope to do. And that is, I'm going to go through this presentation in about 15 or 20 minutes. And then, as I said, we might, at the end, I've got some ideas that we haven't really talked about at any length in this conference as far as I know. And maybe just break into small groups and spend 15 or 20 minutes to see whether we can sort of brainstorm to come up with any ideas of what people can take back home and actually use. And one other thing that I forgot to say as well is there may be local remedies in people's home countries that work. But those remedies or those avenues may or may not be effective for a variety of reasons. They may be very weak. They may not be very well enforced. Courts may be subject to undue influence. I mean, there's lots of reasons why they don't work in the home country. So I'm looking for sort of venues outside the home country, in venues where hopefully everybody can get a fair go. Okay, so I'm going to spend just a couple minutes on multinational environmental agreements. That's where people look quite often. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Regional Human Rights Conventions, where people do have some avenues. Talk about multinational development banks, which we haven't talked about a whole lot, and hopefully Owen can pitch in on that part because he's quite the expert on that. Voluntary corporate initiatives. I'll talk some about that. I think that's underused as well. And then finally, we'll move into the other. I've got World Trade Organization up there, but just over the last 5 days, I've sort of made a list of other sort of venues that might be appropriate. In going through this, I'd like to sort of talk about, looks from a legal perspective. I think most of us in the room are lawyers, and I think we often forget, to sort of think about it from a pure litigation perspective. I'm certainly not a litigator. It's certainly not my strength. But I think we need to sort of understand, those issues up there. I'm spending just a little bit of time on them. Standing and parties to the proceedings. Who actually has a right to bring an action against whom? And I think that's an important consideration that we need to consider. The problem with most multinational environmental agreements is that the words are very strong, but in fact, normally individuals are not able to take any action themselves. And then when the actions are taken, it's against the state. And normally it's a state against state. And in countries where you have states that are dependent upon other countries for aid or cooperation, they're very likely to do that.
We'll talk a little bit about the adjudicators in each one of these venues, whether they're independent, whether they're not independent. Talk about causes of action. What is it that an individual or an NGO can actually accuse somebody of doing incorrectly? Is it tort liability? Probably not. It's normally found in a treaty or some other international agreement. I won't talk a whole lot about process because you probably wouldn't remember when I left here, when we all left here anyway, so I won't talk a whole lot about that, but of course it's very important, and very important to get that right. And then probably the area where international agreements fall down the most, and that's with respect to remedies. And so I will try to focus on the remedies a little bit. Basically, who holds whom accountable and how. Okay, next one. Okay, so we'll move on to the multinational environmental agreements. Next slide. And start with the quiz. Which of the following allow individuals or NGOs to participate in the process? Okay, question A, Aarhus Convention. B, ESPO. C, World Heritage Convention. D, all of the above. Or E, none of the above. Okay, so one more click, please. Okay, so who says A? Only A.